My name is Dara Langley. I'm 34 years old. And 5 years ago, I walked out of my family's life without looking back. At the time, they said I'd regret it. They said no one would ever take a woman like me seriously. Not with calloused hands, a working-class wardrobe, and dreams of opening a restaurant instead of running a fund. But last night, my father choked on a glass of vintage Bordeaux when the waiter leaned in and said, "Welcome back, Ms. Langley. Your usual table." Just 5 minutes earlier, my sister had sneered across the white linen tablecloth and asked, "Can you even afford this place?" I didn't answer. I just watched them eat food I designed, in a restaurant I built, in a space they once said I'd never belong. But let's start at the beginning, with the envelope. The kind of envelope that doesn't need to be opened to break your heart. It was early April. The kind of spring afternoon in Manhattan where the sun reflects off steel and glass, like it's trying to blind you. I had just finished reviewing a new seasonal pasta dish with my sous chef Miranda when Julian, our front-of-house manager, walked into the kitchen holding a piece of mail. It was heavy cream-colored, embossed initials, a wax seal, my name printed in clean serif, Ms. Dara Langley. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Only one person in my family still used stationery that expensive, my mother. I peeled the envelope open slowly. There was a thick card inside. The font was elegant. Cold. "You are cordially invited to the rehearsal dinner of Valerie Langley and Connor Prestwick. Date May 14th. Time 7:00 p.m. Venue Felix House." I blinked. Once, twice. Felix House. My restaurant. My kitchen. The one I had poured my soul into for 5 relentless years. I stood there holding the invitation in one hand and the knowledge of that irony in the other. Some intern of Valerie's must have booked the venue, probably impressed by the Michelin star and the wine pairings. They had no idea they were walking right into my domain. At the bottom of the invitation, in my mother's handwriting, slanted and deliberate, there was a single sentence: "Please dress appropriately. This is a formal affair. No warmth, no 'we miss you', no hope to see you. Just a warning, a boundary." I laughed, but not because it was funny. I laughed because I realized this was the first time in 5 years that they had invited me back into their world. Not because they missed me, not because they forgave me, but because they didn't know. They didn't know that Felix House was mine. I sat down on a kitchen stool and stared at the stainless steel counters. My team was prepping for service. I could hear the steady rhythm of knives, the low hiss of boiling stocks. This was my life now. This was the life they once called a phase, a mistake. 5 years ago, I left with 2 suitcases and a vision no one believed in. Now they were coming to celebrate in the very place I built. I could have declined the invitation, pretended it never came, deleted the memory along with the thousands of other slights I had buried over the years. But something in me, some quiet ancient part, said, "No. Go. Go and let them see you. Not as the daughter they dismissed, not as the failure they whispered about, but as the woman they never imagined you'd become." So I RSVP'd. Yes, with a note looking forward to it. And just like that, the table was set. The guests were confirmed. And the real course, the one I had been preparing in silence for half a decade, was about to begin. I still remember the sound of the front door, not the slam itself, but the moment right before it closed. When the air shifted, the silence changed, and I knew it was over. It was a Tuesday night in early spring, the kind of evening when the house smelled like expensive candles and reheated ambition. Valerie was home from law school, tossing around terms like clerkship and Supreme Court trajectory. Caleb was preparing for his first hedge fund rotation. And I was about to tell my parents I was walking away from the MBA program they had orchestrated my entire life to lead me into. I rehearsed it for days, every sentence, every fallback phrase. But nothing prepared me for the moment my father looked up from his decanter and said, "Culinary school." Are you joking? I wasn't. I had been accepted into the Culinary Institute of America. Full admission. I had even declined my summer internship with the equity firm they handpicked for me. I tried to explain it to them, not just the logistics, but the feeling. The way cooking made me breathe differently, the way flavors rearranged my grief, my silence, my confusion into something tangible. But my mother cut in before I could finish. She was wearing one of her ivory blouses, the kind that matched the walls of the formal dining room perfectly. She didn't raise her voice. That would have been too pedestrian. Instead, she set her wine glass down with the precision of someone removing a chess piece. Dara, you want to throw away 2 generations of legacy to play with knives? I stood my ground. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't. I told them I wasn't asking for approval. Only honesty, only room to breathe. My father's expression turned sharp. Not angry, worse. Disappointed. We've invested everything in your education, he said, his voice low and final. And now you expect us to bankroll a hobby? No, I replied. I expect you to let me go. Valerie laughed under her breath. You'll be back, or crawl back once the romance of grease traps and minimum wage wears off. Caleb didn't say much. He never did in conflict. But he didn't look at me either, which in our house was the same thing as betrayal. They didn't ask where I was going. They didn't ask if I had a plan. They didn't even ask if I had a place to sleep that night. My mother stood up and walked to the bar cart. She poured herself a small Scotch neat, a drink she only ever reserved for closing statements and emotional executions. If you leave tonight, she said calmly, you leave without our name, our resources, and our protection. I nodded. I had expected as much. I walked upstairs, packed a single suitcase, clothes, a chef's knife someone had gifted me at a summer program, and a recipe notebook I had started at 17 and never showed a soul. I paused once at the top of the staircase, looking down at the portraits on the wall. Everyone smiling, everyone polished, everyone pretending. I carried my bag to the front door. No one followed, no one called my name. I turned the knob and stepped out into the night. It was colder than I expected, but I didn't shiver. I hailed a cab to Queens, to the couch of a friend's cousin who barely knew me. I had $200 in my checking account. No job, no safety net. But I had a direction, and for the first time in my life, it was entirely my own. That night, I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was already moving forward. Sometimes the loudest goodbyes are the ones no one bothers to say. And in that silence, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't come back to prove them wrong. I would build a life so whole, so rooted, that even their absence wouldn't leave a mark. I held the invitation in my hands for a long time after the kitchen had gone quiet. The staff had moved into their usual rhythm, checking mise en place, adjusting wine temperatures, polishing glasses that were already spotless. But I wasn't seeing any of it. My eyes were fixed on the cardstock, thick, impressive, meaningless. I had no intention of going at first. Why would I? They hadn't spoken to me in 5 years. Not when I launched Eden's Table. Not when I earned my first feature in Bon Appetit. Not when the New York Times called me a rising force in American cuisine. But there they were now inviting me to dinner, at my restaurant. Without knowing it was mine, I could have called, could have told them, could have made a scene. But as I stood in the stillness of the prep kitchen, surrounded by the very world they once called a waste of time, a different instinct took over. Calmer, sharper, colder. I won't explain myself again. I whispered it. Not to them. To myself. That was the pact. No explanations. No grand reveals. No monologues about redemption or success. Just presence. Let them walk into my world blindfolded by their own assumptions. Let them dine under my roof, sip my wine, critique my food, believing I'm still the one who lost. I wouldn't correct them. Not yet. Because sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Just truth waiting fully formed for the right moment to rise. So I turned to Julian, who was still watching me from the pass, waiting for a signal. I handed him the envelope and said, add this to our May calendar. Private event. 7 guests. He didn't ask questions. He never did. Just nodded and filed it away like it was any other reservation. But we both knew it wasn't. This wasn't just a dinner. This was the last course in a 5-year recipe I'd been perfecting in silence. And now, the table was set. People talk about starting over like it's some kind of awakening. Like you throw off the weight of the past and just rise. But starting over for me was a slow unraveling, one callus, one blister, one overnight shift at a time. After I walked out of that house, I spent the first month sleeping on a couch that sank in the middle. A friend of a friend had offered it, no questions, no judgment. Just a couch in a basement apartment in Woodside, with a broken space heater and a sink that gurgled like it was haunted. By day, I worked prep at a bistro in Midtown, mostly cutting onions, washing crates of produce, hauling trash bags bigger than me down grimy service elevators. I showed up early, stayed late, kept my head down. By afternoon, I was bussing tables at a cafe near Union Square. Not glamorous, not stable, but it paid cash. Then at night, I pulled weekend shifts at a bakery in Queens. It was quiet, oddly comforting, just me, a radio playing old jazz, and trays of dough rising in the dark. I averaged 4 hours of sleep split in shifts. Napped on benches, sometimes corners of dry storage. Twice, I woke up with a bag of flour as my pillow. I didn't complain. There was no one to complain to. My hands were the first to go. Smooth, soft palms turned into a map of cuts and burns. I still remember the worst one, a steam burn that ran across 3 knuckles. I wrapped it in paper towel and kept slicing tomatoes. There was no time to be fragile, no room for pain. Every injury came with the same unspoken rule: cover it up, push through. People around me moved fast, too fast. And no one waited for the girl who used to attend alumni mixers and now showed up with grease under her nails. I didn't tell anyone where I had come from. Not the Ivy League, not the Langley name. It didn't matter there. In the kitchen, respect wasn't inherited. It was earned. By repetition, precision, endurance. I learned to chop faster, cleaner. I learned to fold a napkin like it was origami. I learned to anticipate the mood of the head chef just by the way he wiped his station. I learned to disappear when needed and to be indispensable when it counted. But more than anything, I learned how to belong to myself. Not to a legacy, not to a bloodline. Just me, what I could hold, create, endure. There were nights I came home and stared at the ceiling, trying not to cry from sheer exhaustion. Not sadness, not regret. Just emptiness. The kind of hollow that makes you question if you even exist outside of motion. But then I'd remember the recipes tucked into the back of my notebook. The ideas I was saving for someday, for if ever. A beet tart with smoked ricotta. A savory sorbet infused with lime leaf and mint. A broth that mimicked the silence of winter. I wasn't cooking them yet, not in real kitchens, but I was building them in my head, one idea at a time. And slowly, without even realizing it, I was constructing something bigger than survival. I was shaping a vision. One blistered hand, one midnight shift, one burned knuckle at a time. Because underneath every scar, a seed was taking root. I met Claire Ishimoto on a Wednesday night I almost skipped. I was 2 months into my 3rd job, running on instant coffee and adrenaline. I hadn't had a real conversation in days, just shouted orders and ticket numbers. My shift at the Midtown Bistro had ended late, and the plan was to crash early on the bakery floor for once. But Raphael, the pastry chef, pulled me aside and said, "You need to meet someone. She's asking about new cooks who don't talk too much." That alone intrigued me. He gave me an address in Chinatown. No name, just a time, 9:45 p.m. And a warning: don't bring anything but your hands. I followed the directions and found myself outside a 2nd-floor walk-up above a closed bookstore. The hallway smelled like steamed rice and floor polish. I knocked once, then twice. The door opened with a slow creak, and a woman in a black linen apron looked me over. Her hair was short, sharp, like everything about her. "Dara Langley?" she asked. I nodded. "Claire," she said simply. "Let's see what you can do." Inside was a kitchen unlike any I'd worked in. It wasn't big, it wasn't bright, but it was curated, intentional, a kind of sacred space. 10 burners, 5 prep stations. No noise but the low hum of ventilation and soft jazz playing from a corner speaker. 3 cooks were already at work, slicing fish, plating tiny orbs of something citrusy, brushing pastries with gold. Claire pointed to a pile of root vegetables and said, "Slice them fine enough to whisper." "You have 15 minutes. I didn't ask questions, didn't explain myself. Just picked up the knife and got to work. 15 minutes later, she inspected my station without a word. Then she tasted one of the slices raw. She looked up. "Where did you train?" I hesitated. I told her the truth. "Nowhere. I watch. I read. I test things. I burn a lot." Claire nodded slowly, then said the words that to this day changed the trajectory of my life. "You're not a chef yet, but you're a visionary. And vision doesn't care where you came from." I started working her underground supper club that same weekend. It was invitation only. 12 guests, one seating per night. Each dish had a name, a theme, a story. No menus, just trust. We served duck fat macarons with fermented cherry, sea urchin risotto that melted like memory, and desserts that smoked like winter air. I wasn't just cooking, I was finally creating. And people noticed, not just the guests, but Claire. She let me design one course per night, then two, then entire menus. It wasn't glamorous. We still cleaned our own dishes, and I still burned my arms on the oven doors. But I felt seen, not as a daughter trying to rebel, not as a dropout with calloused hands, but as an artist with something worth tasting. 6 months into working with Claire, I got the chance I didn't dare hope for. It came on a Thursday night between the scallop course and the braised short ribs. We'd just finished plating when she leaned against the counter and said, "There's someone here you need to meet." I wiped my hands on my apron. Someone who wants to eat or someone who wants to invest. She smiled barely. Both. And he doesn't believe in resumes. So don't lie. Just be you. That's how I met Sloan Merrill. He was tall, precise, and looked like the kind of man who once ruled a trading floor, but got tired of the noise. He didn't ask how old I was. He didn't ask about my degree. He just asked, "What would you do if someone gave you a kitchen with no rules?" I answered without thinking. I'd create a space where food doesn't have to explain itself. He stared at me for a long time, then said, "I have a vacant brownstone in Bed-Stuy. It's half rotted, but the bones are good. Want to see it tomorrow?" I showed up at 9 a.m. sharp. The place smelled like old wood and city rain. There were holes in the ceiling and graffiti on the brick, but there was light, huge windows that poured sunlight across the floor like blessing. That night I stayed up sketching layouts on parchment paper and grease-stained napkins. A long communal table, open kitchen, no hierarchy. Just chef's food and stories. I named it Eden's Table, not because of the biblical reference, but because Eden was never about perfection, it was about origin, about coming home. Sloan agreed to fund the build-out on one condition. Don't cook to impress. Cook to speak. So I did. We opened 6 months later with no press, no PR, no photos. Only a handwritten sign that said, "Reservations by word of mouth only." The first night we served 12 people. 2 were Claire's friends. 3 were walk-ins. The rest were curious neighbors. I cooked like I had something to prove because I did. And when dessert went out, dark chocolate mousse with burnt fig and sea salt, I stood in the back gripping the prep table like a lifeline. Claire came up behind me and whispered, "You did it. You brought them to your table." Eden's Table became a secret in plain sight. Every night we dimmed the lights, lit taper candles, and told stories through food. People cried over soup, laughed over oysters, made confessions over poached pears, and slowly the whispers began. A food critic from a niche publication called it the most honest dining room in Brooklyn. An editor from Food and Wine left us a handwritten note. Finally, someone's cooking with memory, not ego. But the biggest shock came from a reservation under a name I didn't recognize. Julian. He showed up 3 nights in a row. On the third, he introduced himself, said he ran front of house for Michelin-starred spots across the city, but had never seen a dining room feel like a living room. I hired him that night. No formal interview, just an offer. Help me build something no one's ready for. He shook my hand and said, "Then we'll need better wine glasses." From there, everything moved faster. We outgrew the brownstone in just under a year. Claire suggested a rebrand, something bolder, more discreet. And so Felix House was born. But to me, it would always be Eden, because it was the first place I didn't need to explain who I was, and the last place I ever apologized for it. The night of the dinner, it rained. Not a heavy downpour, just a steady, irritating drizzle that left streaks on the restaurant's tall front windows and turned the sidewalk outside into a blurred mirror of Manhattan's chaos. I stood across the street under a black umbrella, watching the glow of Felix House spill into the night like warm candlelight. From here, it looked like any exclusive restaurant in the city, timeless, expensive, curated. But I knew every inch of it, the linen weight, the lighting angles, the exact placement of every knife on every table. And tonight, for the first time, I would walk through the front door. Not as the chef, not as the owner, but as a guest. I crossed the street and stepped through the glass door. The scent hit me first. Saffron toasted garlic wine, reduced to its deepest whisper. The smell of work, of pride, of years. The hostess at the front podium glanced up and did a double take. "Ms. Langley," she said softly, "your party has arrived. Center table as requested." Of course, Valerie would have insisted on the best table smack in the middle of the room, where every entrance, every waiter, every movement revolved around her. I gave a slight nod and followed the hostess past tables of polished strangers, their conversations humming low beneath the jazz trio playing in the far corner. And then I saw them, my family, perfectly arranged like a still life of privilege and posture. My father sat at the head of the table, swirling a glass of wine like it owed him something. My mother was in navy satin, her posture painfully upright, one manicured hand resting over a pearl-studded clutch. Valerie, of course, was already mid-sentence. I could tell by the way her fiancé Connor leaned in, his expression set in that corporate half-smile people wear when networking. Caleb was the only one who looked remotely relaxed. He gave a small wave when he saw me, unsure if it was welcome, unsure if I would wave back. I didn't. I just kept walking. As I approached, Valerie stood halfway, not to greet me but to calculate. Her eyes scanned me from shoes to necklace, like she was totaling receipts. I wore a fitted black dress, simple, tailored, no designer label screaming for attention. My hair was slicked back into a low bun. A single silver ring on my right hand. "Dara," my mother said, rising to press an air kiss to each cheek. "You're on time. That's refreshing." "I always was," I replied. She smiled, brittle and tight. "Perhaps, but time and presence aren't always the same." Connor stood and offered a hand. His grip was firm, overly so. "A test." "Connor Prestwick," he said as if I didn't know. "Managing Director, Mergers and Acquisitions." "I read titles better than handshakes," I replied. My father offered a curt nod. No smile, no warmth, just a stiff greeting. "Dara," he said. "You look healthy," which in Langley speak meant I didn't look thin enough for their standards. I resisted the urge to laugh. Valerie gestured to the seat across from her. "The last empty one. Please," she said with a tight smile. "Join us." As I pulled out the chair and settled in, I could feel the weight of their stares. Not curious, not kind, but scanning, looking for cracks, looking for the familiar failure. I smoothed my napkin across my lap and looked up. So I said calmly, "What's for dinner?" And just like that, I took my seat at their table in my house. I had just taken my first sip of water when Julian appeared. He moved like he always did, gracefully, quietly invisible to anyone who hadn't worked beside him in the trenches of dinner service. But to me, every step, every glance, every breath of his carried intention. He approached the table from behind my father's left shoulder, holding a wine list in one hand, perfectly balanced. And then he said it. "Welcome back, Ms. Langley. Your usual table is available if you'd prefer it." I didn't blink, I didn't smile, I didn't shift. I simply looked at him, gave the faintest nod, and replied, "Not tonight, Julian. Thank you." The silence that followed was visceral. My father's hand paused mid-pour. My mother's eyes flicked to mine, then to Julian, and back, searching for some missed memo, some context that might restore her sense of control. Valerie tilted her head slightly, lips parting just enough to speak, but nothing came out. And Connor, he was the first to break the moment. "You two know each other." His tone was casual, forced, like someone pretending not to smell smoke. Julian, ever the professional, turned to the group and said evenly, "Ms. Langley has dined with us before. We're always honored to have her." I could see the twitch in my mother's jaw, the subtle way she repositioned her knife and fork, an unconscious recalibration. "Dined here," Valerie echoed. "You mean you've eaten here? I thought this place just opened last year." "It did," I said, setting my glass down. "But I find consistency matters more than novelty." "Don't you?" Connor chuckled lightly, still trying to regain his footing. "Guess it helps to know the right people." Julian placed the wine list gently in front of him. "If I may, Mr. Prestwick, we've already prepared the bottle your assistant requested." "Shall I decant it, please?" Connor said, clearly relieved to shift the attention. But the damage was already done, because no one had ever referred to me as Ms. Langley in public. Not in a tone like that. Not with deference. and no one in my family had ever associated my name with a usual table in a place like this. The weight of it lingered. I didn't offer explanations, I didn't volunteer details. Let them guess, let the questions build. I picked up my menu not to read it, but to give them space to squirm. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother whisper something to Valerie. Connor leaned back and scanned the dining room like he was searching for clues. But Julian was already gone, gliding toward the wine station, leaving behind nothing but the echo of those words. "Welcome back, Ms. Langley." Like I'd never left. Like I belonged. And for the first time that evening, I didn't feel like a guest at that table. I felt like the gravity in the room had shifted. Quietly, irrevocably. I've eaten at this table before, not this literal table, of course, but tables just like it. Polished surfaces dressed in linen and performance, surrounded by people who called themselves family, but never made room for me to sit without condition. And yet here I was again, at the center of everything, and somehow still on the outside. Across from me, Valerie was smiling a little too hard. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. The kind meant to assert control without saying a word. Her fiancé Connor kept glancing my way between sips of wine, clearly trying to recalibrate. His mental math was loud. If I had a usual table here, if the staff knew me by name, if I wasn't the failure they'd been prepared to see, then who exactly was I now? To his left, my mother sat motionless, her fingers resting on her napkin as though she might crush it if she squeezed any harder. I could feel her analyzing everything: my dress, my tone, my ease, looking for a flaw, looking for a thread to pull. My father said nothing. He watched the restaurant instead, like a man studying a battlefield he once believed he owned. But even in his silence, I saw it: uncertainty. The one thing he had never allowed himself to feel around me. Caleb, seated beside me, leaned in slightly. "It's beautiful in here," he said softly. "Did you help with the design?" I met his eyes. Caleb never chose sides when we were younger. But he never defended me either. He floated between loyalties, hoping neutrality would keep him safe. It rarely did. "Just lucky to find a place that fits," I replied. He nodded like he knew there was more to it, but he didn't ask. And that's what defined this family. They never asked. They assumed. They inferred. They decorated the silence between us with polite judgment and shallow praise. A waiter approached and refilled my glass. The momentary pause in conversation gave me time to study the room. I watched as another server glided by, setting amuse-bouche plates in front of a nearby couple. I saw the flicker of candlelight dancing across the brass accents on the wall, the gentle sway of the jazz trio in the corner. And it struck me, they were all guests in my world. Even now, seated beside me, across from me, sipping from the stemware I'd personally selected, they didn't realize. They didn't recognize my fingerprint on every detail. Didn't see the architecture of me layered into the menu, the lighting, the tone of the staff's voices. Because they weren't looking. They never had. At this table, I was still a stranger. Still the girl who walked away. Still the disappointment they discussed in hushed tones over champagne. And for the first time, I wasn't hurt by it. I wasn't desperate to be seen. Because I had learned something in the 5 years since I left. Visibility isn't granted, it's claimed. So I took another sip of water, folded my napkin neatly, and sat a little straighter. Let them talk. Let them wonder. I wouldn't give them answers. Not yet. The performance had only just begun. And I had written every line. The first course arrived with elegant, soft footsteps, synchronized placements, and quiet precision. Each plate was centered perfectly, compressed watermelon sphere with fermented black garlic, garnished with microgreens grown on our rooftop garden, just one bite. But that bite had taken 3 years of testing and 20 seconds of silence to present properly. Julian nodded as the servers stepped away, and for a moment there was a stillness. The kind of stillness chefs pray for before the first fork touches down. Valerie broke it. Of course. She stared at her plate like it had offended her. "Is this it?" she asked, turning to Connor. "I thought this place had actual portions." "It's an amuse-bouche," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "It's not meant to fill you. It's meant to open your palate," she smirked. "Oh, I know what an amuse-bouche is, Dara. I took a cooking class in Paris." Connor leaned over his plate and gave the watermelon a skeptical glance. "It's raw garlic, isn't it?" I didn't answer. There was no point. My mother placed the tiniest corner of the sphere on her fork and brought it to her mouth like it might explode. She chewed slowly, swallowed, set her fork down with delicate dissatisfaction. Interesting, she murmured, which in her dialect meant disappointing. It's fermented black garlic, I offered, aged for 60 days. The sweetness is intentional. Yes, she said, dabbing at her lips with her napkin, but the aftertaste lingers. I suppose that's the point. Valerie didn't touch hers. She pushed the plate an inch away and tilted her wine glass toward Connor. I don't do raw anything. You know that, Connor shrugged. I actually like it. It's just surprising. Different. I almost smiled. He sounded like someone trying to compliment a painting he didn't understand. My father was the only one who finished the bite without comment. Then again, silence was his sharpest tool. The servers returned with the next course: heirloom tomato salad with house-made ricotta basil oil and toasted pine nut crumble, a dish that celebrated restraint, balance, memory. I had designed it during a summer when I couldn't afford fresh cheese, so I learned to make my own in a cracked ceramic bowl with a kitchen thermometer and a lot of hope. It tasted like survival and pride. Valerie picked at hers with the tip of her fork. These tomatoes, they could be riper, she said. Feels a little acidic for something this dressed up. Connor chimed in, swirling his wine. And the ricotta's gritty. Or is that on purpose? I felt Miranda's eyes on me from the pass. She had prepped that cheese herself this morning at dawn. The grit is from the pine nut crumble, I explained. We toast them with a touch of brown sugar and sea salt for texture. My mother sighed, soft but deliberate. In my day, she began, you could go to a restaurant and leave full. Not just entertained. I set down my fork. We serve 7 courses, I said calmly. It's a tasting menu. Each dish is part of a larger narrative. She replied. So we're dining on metaphors. Caleb, who had been quiet, cleared his throat. I think it's beautiful, he said. Every bite feels like it's been thought through. I glanced at him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to notice. Connor leaned back in his chair. Well, I hope there's a steak coming, or something I can actually chew. I smiled just slightly, because I already knew what was next. Duck breast, perfectly seared, medium rare, served with cherry gastrique and farro cooked in bone broth. A dish that doesn't explain itself. It just demands to be tasted. And as they picked apart my courses with their curated critiques and half-formed culinary jargon, I stayed silent. Because this wasn't just food. This was a test. And they didn't even know they were taking it. Valerie waited until the 4th course, a saffron risotto with seared scallops, before she pounced. The wine had warmed her cheeks. Her words were looser now, but sharper too. Like someone spinning threads just to see which one would snap first. So she began spearing a scallop. What is it that you do, Dara? She gestured vaguely around the restaurant. Aside from ordering amuse-bouche and pretending you're not surprised to be here. Connor chuckled. Not because it was funny, but because he didn't want to be the only one not laughing. I set down my fork slowly. I work in food, I said evenly, as if the word itself didn't deserve more decoration. Valerie tilted her head. Yes, but what does that mean? She dragged her fork through her plate, making a mess of the creamy risotto. Are you like a consultant, a food stylist? Or is this more of a hobby thing? I caught my mother watching from the corner of her eye. Quiet, but listening. I own a business, I replied. Simple, true, unrevealing. Oh, you're self-employed. She said the words like they were a euphemism, like she was offering me a polite way to say unemployed. That must be freeing, Connor added. Not having to report to anyone. Unless you count the health department, I said lightly. He laughed again, this time with a little more discomfort. Valerie leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. But seriously, though. You said you left Boston. You dropped off the map. You don't post anything. You don't come to holidays. Are you okay? The tone was syrupy, mock concerned. She wasn't asking if I was okay. She was asking if I had failed. Because in her mind, silence meant shame. Distance meant debt. Absence meant I had nothing to show. I'm fine, I said. Because she continued ignoring me. It's just weird. Mom and Dad thought maybe you were working at a food truck or something. Which honestly, no shame. But we just didn't know. You didn't even RSVP to the Christmas card. I never received a Christmas card. She blinked. Well, it was sent. Maybe your address is outdated. Do you even live in the city anymore? I do. She said, and took another sip of wine. We just thought you might be doing better by now, like financially. She didn't smile when she said it. Because this wasn't teasing anymore. This was targeted, a test, to see if I'd crack, to see if I'd flinch. I picked up my fork again and took a slow bite of risotto. Let the silence stretch. Let the discomfort settle into the space between her words and mine. I'm doing well, I said finally. Soft, controlled, unbothered. That's great, she said, and leaned in with a smirk. So, just curious, what kind of revenue does a place like this pull in monthly ballpark? There it was. The question she'd been circling like a hawk. I don't really discuss numbers at dinner. Oh, come on, Connor said, half laughing. We're all family here. That word again. Family. As if it meant safety. As if it had ever protected me. I looked directly at Valerie. I'm not here to prove anything, she blinked. Then laughed. But I didn't. Because the truth was I could give her numbers. I could list off the investors, the press features, the month-over-month margins. But I wouldn't. Not tonight. Let them guess. Let them stew in their own assumptions. They had built a version of me in their minds, and they were dying to see her confirmed. But I wasn't here for confirmation. I was here to reclaim space. On my terms. Silently, precisely, like I'd learned to do one fork, one course, one answer at a time. It came during dessert. Just when the sugar was supposed to dull everything sharp. The crème brûlée had been torched perfectly, glass-thin, top pale golden base. I could tell by the sound it made when I cracked it. The kind of detail that should have sparked a smile. Instead, I felt it coming before he said it. You've always been good at pretending, Connor said, suddenly spooning a chunk of custard into his mouth. Even back in school you had that vibe. Like you weren't broke even when we all knew you were. I didn't flinch. Not because it didn't sting, but because I'd heard that line before. Almost word for word. In another house, another state, another version of my life. That time it had come from Valerie. Back when I showed up to a cousin's wedding in a dress I'd bought secondhand and altered by hand. It's cute, she'd said. You make it work like always. Even when you don't have much. They always wrapped it in admiration, disguised cruelty as compliment. As if that made it easier to swallow. It's called dignity, I said, not raising my eyes from the custard. You should try it sometime. Connor blinked, his smile faltering. Just a flicker, but it was enough. I didn't mean anything by it, he said quickly. It's just, you've always had this way of seeming like you belong anywhere, even when you didn't. There it was again, even when you didn't. The implication burned hotter than the sugar shell. Valerie looked between us and shrugged like this was all harmless banter. Like she hadn't trained him to talk this way. My mother reached for her wine again. No one stopped her. I let the silence bloom. Let it fill every glass, every fork, every unfinished sentence. Because they needed me to react. They needed a show. Needed me to confirm what they believed about people who leave. That we leave out of failure. That we only come back to prove something. But I didn't come to prove anything. I came to remember. To sit here in this chair in my restaurant and listen to them try to make me small again and fail. So I smiled. Took one slow bite. Let the silence sharpen my spine. And in that moment, I knew the next course wouldn't be served on a plate. Every bite felt like strategy. Not enjoyment, not nourishment. Strategy. I cut into the duck breast with care, precisely, elegantly. Let the blade glide through the crisp skin, like I wasn't listening to Valerie explaining for the third time how she'd once attended a chef's tasting in Paris. It's all about texture, she said, swirling her wine. Most people think flavor is everything, but you can tell a real chef by their mouthfeel discipline. Mouthfeel discipline. She said it like she'd invented the term. Like I hadn't spent a year perfecting the exact crispness of the duck skin, she was now misidentifying as too French. Connor chimed in, pointing at the small quenelle of puree on his plate. You know what, this needs salt. Whoever runs this kitchen is afraid of salt. I smiled faintly, because they were in my restaurant, eating my food, critiquing what I had spent years building without knowing it. Every course had been prepared exactly as I instructed. Not just the recipes, the plating, the timing, the flow. This dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a quiet, deliberate performance. And I was the director hiding in plain sight. But to them I was still Dara the dropout. Dara the disappointment. Dara who left and vanished and probably scraped by doing God knows what. Valerie turned toward me. This reminds me of that meal Mom made the night before you left, she said suddenly. Remember the lemon chicken? You cried because she wouldn't make you a separate side dish. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't remember, but because she was wrong. It wasn't the lemon chicken, it was the rice. And I didn't cry because I didn't get a separate dish. I cried because they all sat and ate like nothing was happening, like I hadn't told them I was leaving. Like I wasn't packing my life into a suitcase upstairs. Like I hadn't begged quietly, calmly for someone to ask why. But no one did. That's what made me cry, not the food, the silence. Connor stabbed his fork into the duck and muttered, "Too much pink." You'd think for a place this pretentious they'd at least learn how to cook meat. I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth and breathed. In through the nose, out through the performance. Because it wasn't about the duck, or the seasoning, or the plating. It was about the control. They needed to feel smarter, taller, more in the know. Because deep down they sensed something wasn't aligning. They couldn't say it not yet, but they felt it. Why were the servers so deferential? Why did the sommelier bow when pouring my glass? Why did Julian, the maitre d', refer to me by last name without blinking? They felt it. And it made them squirm, so they sharpened their comments like cutlery, tried to poke holes in an identity they couldn't recognize, tried to push me back into the shape they once assigned me. And I played along, bit by bit, smile by smile, bite by bite, because this wasn't the time to explain. It was the time to let them walk deeper into their own assumptions until they were too far in to back out gracefully, until the final course arrived, until the bill came. Valerie leaned across the table, her elbow dangerously close to the edge of my plate, and said it with a laugh too sweet to be sincere. "So Dara, who are you dating to afford this place?" It was the tone that did it. Light, casual, like gossip shared between sisters, but her eyes were razor-sharp, scanning me for a flinch. She wanted to poke the facade she believed I wore, test the seams for cracks, see if I'd confess finally that someone else had paid for my seat at this table, for my tailored dress, for the gold pin at my collar. "No one," I said, keeping my gaze on the water glass, as I turned it slightly, aligning the logo at the base with the tablecloth stitch. "Just me," she scoffed softly. "Please, you're not on any payroll that pays for wine lists like this." Connor chimed in before I could respond, snapping his fingers at the waiter. "Hey, yeah, we'll take the Margot, the 2005. He turned to Valerie. "You said you liked Bordeaux, right?" The sommelier, a quiet man with discerning eyes, hesitated. "The Chateau Margaux 2005 is priced at $780, sir," Connor laughed. "Well, then it better taste like magic." He looked at me, almost daring me to object. Valerie raised her brows. My mother didn't say a word. I folded my napkin onto my lap with deliberate calm. Because I wasn't surprised. Not anymore. This was their pattern. When they didn't understand something, they mocked it. When they couldn't control it, they tested its limits. And when something made them feel small, they tried to make it expensive. Valerie smirked at me over her glass of white. "So what is it you do now?" "Dara, don't say consulting, that's everyone's go-to when they're unemployed, but still need a LinkedIn profile." I took a sip of water, felt the coolness anchor me. "I manage a few things," I said, which was true. More than she could imagine. "Like what?" Her voice tilted upward, sharp with disbelief. Across the table, my mother reached for the bread without looking up, still silent, still absent in all the ways that counted. And it hit me not like a slap, not like fire, but like clarity. This wasn't about the restaurant, or the wine, or even about me. It was about a family that needed me to stay small so they wouldn't have to ask themselves why they never grew. And it was the moment I stopped needing them to understand. I turned to the sommelier and smiled gently. "Bring the Margot." Then I folded my hands in my lap, leaned back into the chair I paid for, and waited for the bottle that would cost more than Connor's rent. Not out of vengeance, out of peace. Because sometimes letting someone dig their own hole is the kindest thing you can do, especially when you own the land it's dug on. I could tell the moment the sommelier reappeared. He wasn't carrying the Margot, he was followed. Julian walked beside him, not rushed, not hesitant. Calm, graceful. The kind of presence that makes a room shift, even if nothing's been said. He stopped a few steps from our table. "Miss Langley, he said loud enough for everyone to hear his voice carrying that smooth, practiced poise. Your usual table is ready, whenever you're comfortable. For a moment, silence fell like winter. Forks paused midair. Connor blinked slowly like he'd misheard. Valerie froze, her fingers curled around the stem of her wineglass. My mother finally looked up, eyes narrowing not with curiosity but calculation. I held Julian's gaze. Then I stood, tucked the napkin back on the table with the same composure I had practiced all night. And when I looked at them, I didn't smile to gloat. I didn't scowl to punish. I simply told the truth. This is my restaurant. No one spoke. The words hung heavier than the chandeliers above us. Langley House. I opened it 4 years ago. Claire Ishimoto helped with the launch. You might have read about it in the Times. Still nothing. Not a breath. Not a blink. I don't usually work the floor, but tonight I made an exception. I gestured toward the host stand where a fresh table had just been set. Flowers trimmed, candles lit. That's my actual table. I reserve it for when I dine in alone, or with people I trust. The meaning wasn't lost on anyone. Connor shifted in his seat, looking away. Valerie's lips parted, then closed. My mother, ever the master of pretending nothing happened, reached for her clutch. You tricked us, Valerie asked, voice thin. No, I said quietly. I invited you to dinner. You just didn't care enough to ask why. At that, Julian gently placed a black leather folder on the table, the bill. It sat there like an unopened letter bomb. Connor reached for it, pulling the tab open with an awkward laugh. Well, I hope you have an employee discount for this kind of flex. His face changed. So did his posture. 1,260, he whispered. Then louder, you're seriously making us pay for this. I tilted my head. Why not? You ordered the Margot. Said it better taste like magic. I didn't wait for them to scramble. I didn't need to. Instead, I turned to Julian. Cancel the charge. Then to the sommelier. Send the Margot back to the cellar. Then I looked once more at the people who had called me a burden, a failure, a ghost. This meal was a courtesy, not a gift. And with that, I walked to my usual table, alone, but not diminished. Because in their silence, I heard what I'd waited years for, not apology, not approval, just realization that they had no idea who I had become, and that they never really knew me at all. I hadn't even unfolded my napkin at the new table when I heard it. You're kidding, right? Valerie's voice sliced through the ambient music like a snapped violin string. I didn't turn around, but I could hear her heels scraping the floor as she marched over. Dara, come on, this is a joke. You're not serious. I looked up finally, my face calm, neutral, the way I'd trained it to be in every boardroom, every investor meeting, every panel where people assumed I was just the assistant. You think I'd lie about something like this? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her fingers clutched the back of the chair across from me. Why didn't you ever tell us? It was my mother's voice now. She had followed close behind, less rushed, more curious than confrontational. She wasn't asking out of hurt. She was asking because she couldn't stand being left out of something important. You mean, why didn't I explain myself at every family dinner, or every time I got left off the group email, or when you told the others not to bother inviting me to your wedding because Dara never has anything to wear anyway? Her mouth twitched. Not guilt, just recognition. Like she'd finally connected two dots that had been under her nose all along. You could have said something, she murmured. We assumed you were still figuring things out. That word assumed landed like an old bruise. I gave a quiet laugh. You didn't assume. You decided. There's a difference. And then came the third voice, deeper, cautious, almost performative. My father. He stepped up beside the table, resting his palm lightly on the back of the other chair, like a man surveying a business opportunity instead of approaching his daughter. You're doing quite well for yourself, Dara. I have to admit, this is impressive. I nodded. Thank you. He cleared his throat. I've been thinking of expanding some holdings. Real estate, maybe, or hospitality partnerships. If you ever want to sit down and talk shop, I almost laughed again. You mean now that I'm profitable? His face flickered. Not offense, just adjustment. Like a man recalculating a bet. Don't get the wrong idea, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. Really. Proud. The word sat strangely in the air. It wasn't the first time I'd heard it, but it was the first time it sounded like a negotiation. Valerie crossed her arms now. So what this whole thing tonight? Was it just some performance? I looked her in the eyes. No, it was dinner. You're the one who turned it into a test. She bit the inside of her cheek, then scoffed. I guess the joke's on us, huh? I didn't answer. Because I wasn't here for retribution. I wasn't here to make them feel small. I was here to reclaim the space they told me I didn't deserve. And the thing about reclaiming space, you don't need permission, you just show up, unapologetically, and let the truth do the rest. Julian reappeared, then refilling my water, asking if I'd like the tasting menu prepared. I nodded gently. Yes, please. The chef knows my preferences. Behind me, I could still feel their presence hovering, awkward, exposed. But I didn't offer them a seat. Because sometimes growth means knowing who no longer gets access, even if they share your last name. I could have told them everything, about the nights I slept on the floor of the walk-in pantry because rent had to go toward equipment. About the first time someone called my food exquisite in a review that changed everything but spelled my name wrong. About the mornings I stood outside supplier warehouses at 4:30 a.m., pretending I had staff just so I'd be taken seriously. But I didn't owe them that story. Still, as I sat at my usual table, and felt their stares boring into my back, I let myself breathe it in. 5 years, folded neatly into one breath. The first year was chaos. I burned through 3 sous chefs and most of my savings. I learned how to unclog floor drains and repair refrigeration units by watching YouTube videos at 2 a.m. The second year, Claire Ishimoto invested. Quietly. She believed in ideas, not resumes. And she never asked about my family, not once. The third year, the Langley Supper Club opened its second location. Press started paying attention. They wrote about our food, our ambience. They speculated on the mysterious owner who never posed for photos, never gave interviews. They didn't know my face. And that was exactly how I wanted it. In year 4, my pastry chef made it to Forbes Under 30. We built mentorships, partnered with culinary schools, and held secret tasting nights for single moms who couldn't afford fine dining. I kept my name off everything public. Not out of shame, but out of strategy. Because anonymity wasn't hiding. It was freedom. By year 5, the club had a waitlist 3 months long. I declined 2 acquisition offers. I could have expanded franchised, but I didn't. This wasn't just about scale. It was about control. Every fork, every seat, every subtle curve in the lighting was a choice I made. And the people I loved, my chosen family, understood that. Claire, Julian, Chef Marissa, even Mr. Matteo, who delivered our seafood and slipped my staff cold brew on hot days. They knew me. They saw me. Not the girl who left home with a $17 train ticket and a suitcase that squeaked when you dragged it. Not the daughter whose mother warned the cousins don't get too close to Dara. She always has drama. Not the sister whose biggest offense was wanting more than what was offered. No. They saw me. And now, as the real family fidgeted across the room, pretending not to whisper, not to speculate, not to regret, I felt no urge to clear the air. Because the air was mine now. Scented with rosemary oil and sea salt. Filtered through months of intention. Every inhale reminded me I didn't just survive, I built. And you don't owe anyone an explanation for rising quietly. Only the courage to keep going. I didn't plan on saying anything else. Not until my mother stood up and walked toward me, slow, deliberate, like she was entering a negotiation. Her tone wasn't warm. It was rehearsed. Why didn't you tell us sooner, Dara? I looked at her, at the woman who once told a room full of relatives that I'd probably end up needing help again before 30. I folded my hands in my lap. Because I wanted to see how you'd treat me, I said, steady and clear, when you thought I was failing. No one said a word, and I let that silence stretch. Because the truth had been caged inside my chest for years, pacing, waiting, scratching at my ribs. When I left, I continued. No one called. No one asked if I had a plan, not even if I had a place to sleep. I glanced at my sister. Valerie wouldn't meet my eyes. When I emailed to say I was okay, you replied with one line, "Don't bring shame to the family." My voice didn't shake, not anymore. So I stopped trying to prove anything. I started building something that didn't require anyone's permission to exist. My father, who had been quiet this whole time, opened his mouth, then closed it again. Like he didn't know what to say without sounding like a stranger. I stayed silent, I added. Because I didn't want your support out of guilt. Or worse, pity. I let that land. Then leaned back. You see, people show you who they are when they think you have nothing. And I didn't need to test your loyalty. Life already did that for me. My mother's lips parted, but the words didn't come. Because what could she say that she didn't mean it, that she forgot that somehow I'd misunderstood a decade of silence? No. She knew, they all did. And now, finally, I did too. It was Connor who spoke next. He leaned in, one elbow propped casually on the white linen tablecloth, swirling the remnants of his wine like this was still a regular dinner and not the slow disassembling of a shared illusion. You know, Dara, he said, voice smooth. Rehearsed, we've been talking about expanding into hospitality investments. A few boutique restaurants under our belt would look great on the firm's portfolio. I tilted my head, waited. He smiled like he was offering me a gift. We could help you scale, get you out of the niche space and into something more national. Claire once told me the most dangerous investments are the ones that come in your brother's voice. I looked at him for a long time. Not angry, just aware. 5 years ago, he stood on the porch as I left, arms crossed, muttering under his breath. This isn't New York, Dara. No one's going to eat overpriced vegetables from someone who couldn't keep a job. Now, here he was. A man who still didn't know the difference between rosemary and thyme, talking to me like I needed saving. Thank you, I said slowly, letting the weight of the words sit for a beat too long. But I'm not interested. He blinked. I'm serious, he said. We've got capital. You've got the brand. It's just smart business. No, I repeated, firmer now. You're looking for leverage, not partnership. Valerie snorted. She still thought this was ego. I kept my eyes on Connor. You didn't want to sit at my table when you thought I had nothing, I said. Voice quiet. You don't get to sit at it now just because you saw the check. He flinched. Just barely, but I saw it. I built this with intention, I continued. Not to be consumed by the same people who once said I was disposable. He opened his mouth, closed it. I reached for my glass of water, took a sip. Let silence do the rest. Because if they thought this was the part where I'd offer them a lifeline, hand out redemption like dessert menus, they didn't know me at all. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. And now I had it. My mother didn't say much for the rest of the dinner. She dabbed the corners of her mouth with a napkin, like wiping away words she never spoke. I thought that would be the end of it. But as the plates were cleared and the waiter brought around coffee service, she looked up. Would you like to have brunch this weekend? The question wasn't stiff. It wasn't cold. It was uncertain. Like she was trying to remember how to speak to me, not at me. I set down my cup. I didn't answer right away. 5 years ago, she'd told me, you're not the daughter I prayed for. And now she was asking for brunch. The irony would have made me laugh if it didn't sting. Where I asked. She blinked, surprised I didn't say no. Anywhere you like. That was new. Growing up, she chose everything: school's clothes, summer camps, even my hairstyle for my senior year photos. Choice was a privilege I had to buy for myself. I smiled, just a little. There's a spot I like, I said. On Mercer, corner of 5th. She hesitated for a second, then nodded. All right. I knew she didn't realize it yet, but I'd just invited her to my second restaurant. The one with the warm-toned interiors and handwritten menus. The one where the barista knows my order and the pastry chef is a woman I trained myself. This wasn't about showing off. It was about showing her. Not just the success, but the softness I'd preserved. The hospitality I'd built not for applause, but for community. For women who had been told you're too much and turned it into, you're just right. I wasn't sure what this brunch would mean. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But I accepted the invitation because I wasn't doing it as a daughter begging to belong. I was doing it as a woman who finally knew she didn't need permission to take up space. So I nodded and said Sunday at 10. And this time, she didn't flinch. The evening air outside was cooler than I expected. The sky had begun folding into itself, dark indigo bleeding into deeper blue, like even the heavens were exhaling after the dinner. I was halfway down the stone steps of the restaurant when I heard hurried heels behind me. Dara, I turned. It was Valerie. She wasn't walking the way she usually did, head high, spine stiff, like every sidewalk owed her deference. No. This time she looked unsure. She stopped beside me, arms crossed, not defensively, just trying to hold herself together. There was a pause. Then I didn't know. 3 words. Quiet. Fragile. I didn't rush to fill the silence. She looked out at the street. Her voice wavered, not like it was weak, but like it was no longer rehearsed. I thought you were just trying to prove a point when you left. I didn't think you'd actually make it. The way she said make it wasn't bitter. It wasn't envious. It was bewildered. Like watching someone walk out of a burning house without a single burn mark and realizing you never asked if they had help. She rubbed her wrist absent-mindedly, a nervous tic from childhood, one I hadn't seen in years. Then she looked at me. Really looked. Would you have dinner with me, she asked. Just us. No family, no jabs, no scorekeeping. The old Dara version 1.0 might have laughed, might have said, now you want my time. But I wasn't here to replay history. I was here to write a new page if it was worth writing. I studied her face. For once there was no armor, no performance. I remembered the girl who used to braid my hair before school. The one who taught me how to forge Mom's signature on field trip slips. The one who stayed silent when I got grounded for her mistake, and looked like it hurt more than if she'd taken the blame. Somewhere under all the judgment and distance, that girl still lived. And maybe tonight was the first time in years she found her voice again, so I nodded. Yes, I said softly, but you're buying, she smiled. Small but real. Deal. As she turned to go, I called after her, Val. She looked over her shoulder. Next time you assume someone can't afford a place, make sure they don't own it. She laughed, really laughed. And it wasn't cruel or defensive or hollow. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years. And for the first time since I walked out of that house, with nothing but a suitcase and my name, I felt like we might not be strangers forever. I didn't head straight home after that night. Instead, I walked back into the restaurant, past the empty tables, past the velvet curtain that separated the dining room from the private suite behind it. Julian was waiting at the threshold. He didn't say anything, just gave me a slight nod, the kind that meant everything had gone according to plan. I stepped into the private room. The lighting was warm golden, not overly ornate, just enough to feel intentional. Like someone had curated the mood not just for elegance, but for clarity. 3 people stood when I entered. 2 men, 1 woman. All dressed impeccably, though not loudly. They were the kind of people who measured success in precision, not noise. Ms. Langley, one of them said. We weren't sure you'd still come. I gave them a calm smile and slipped into the seat at the head of the table. I told you I'd be 15 minutes late. It wasn't arrogance, just fact. He chuckled and the tension broke. I glanced at the spread, a bottle of red, I personally approved, hand-rolled appetizers from our test kitchen. Everything was curated, and still everything felt effortless. But that wasn't the most comforting part. It was the staff. Anna, our lead sommelier, moved like the room belonged to her because in many ways it did. She had been with me since the first cafe opened. Jamal, who once washed dishes during overnight shifts, now managed investor operations. And Louise, our pastry chef, had just trained 3 interns from culinary schools I never even dreamed of attending. Each of them passed through the room with familiarity and ease, not as employees, but as extensions of what I'd built. As family. The woman across from me folded her hands. We saw the press release. You're expanding to the East Coast, I nodded. And you're here, I added, because you want in before the reservations become impossible to book. No one corrected me, no one challenged it. Because the room knew the truth, they were no longer interviewing me. They were presenting themselves to me. I leaned back slightly and let it sink in. Not the power, but the peace. The subtle, steady peace of knowing that this time I was exactly where I belonged. And everyone in the room knew it. I didn't head straight home after that night. Instead, I walked back into the restaurant, past the empty tables, past the velvet curtain that separated the dining room from the private suite behind it. Julian was waiting at the threshold. He didn't say anything, just gave me a slight nod, the kind that meant everything had gone according to plan. I stepped into the private room. The lighting was warm golden, not overly ornate, just enough to feel intentional. Like someone had curated the mood not just for elegance, but for clarity. 3 people stood when I entered. 2 men, 1 woman. All dressed impeccably, though not loudly. They were the kind of people who measured success in precision, not noise. Ms. Langley, one of them said. We weren't sure you'd still come. I gave them a calm smile and slipped into the seat at the head of the table. I told you I'd be 15 minutes late. It wasn't arrogance, just fact. He chuckled and the tension broke. I glanced at the spread a bottle of red I personally approved hand-rolled appetizers from our test kitchen. Everything was curated and still everything felt effortless. But that wasn't the most comforting part. It was the staff. Anna, our lead sommelier, moved like the room belonged to her, because in many ways, it did. She had been with me since the first cafe opened. Jamal, who once washed dishes during overnight shifts, now managed investor operations. And Luis, our pastry chef, had just trained 3 interns from culinary schools I never even dreamed of attending. Each of them passed through the room with familiarity and ease, not as employees but as extensions of what I'd built. As family. The woman across from me folded her hands. We saw the press release. "You're expanding to the East Coast," I nodded. "And you're here," I added, "because you want in before the reservations become impossible to book." No one corrected me. No one challenged it. Because the room knew the truth, they were no longer interviewing me. They were presenting themselves to me. I leaned back slightly and let it sink in. Not the power, but the peace. The subtle, steady peace of knowing that this time I was exactly where I belonged. And everyone in the room knew it. The meeting wrapped just after 10. We didn't clink glasses or take pictures. That wasn't our style. We signed NDAs and discussed timelines. Our celebration was subtle, a shared nod, a tightened handshake, a refill of wine from a bottle none of us had to look twice at. When the investors left, I stayed behind to breathe. It was quiet again, not the kind of quiet that isolates you, but the kind that holds you. I pulled out my phone expecting a flood of emails, but there was just one message. "Valerie," no emojis, no dramatic punctuation, just words. "Do you still have the name of that florist you used to love? The one with the poppies, I want them for my bouquet." I stared at it. For a moment, I didn't know what to feel. Not because it was surprising, though it was, but because it was gentle. Years ago, she'd laughed when I told her I wanted poppies for my non-existent wedding. "They're so sad," she had said, "like funeral flowers." But now she was asking for them, not because they were trendy, not because they made her look a certain way, but because for once she remembered they had once meant something to me. I didn't respond right away. I set the phone down and walked to the edge of the room where the windows overlooked the street below. Even from the 3rd floor, I could still see the front door of the restaurant, the doorman helping a couple into their car, the faint outline of Julian locking the entryway, the city continuing untouched by the revelations of one dinner. I ran my thumb along the edge of the window frame, and I smiled. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't payback. It was clarity. Valerie's message wasn't an apology, it was an opening. And not every wound needed a speech to begin healing. Sometimes it just needed a quiet gesture, a new association, a poppy and a bridal bouquet. So I picked up my phone, typed back slowly, "It's still the same florist. I'll send you her number," and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was pretending to be her sister. I felt like maybe we were learning how to become one. I used to think my story would begin with a recipe. A roux maybe because it takes patience. Or a loaf of bread because that's what I survived on when I had nothing else. But tonight, after all of it, the silence, the wine, the old wounds dressed as fine fabric. I finally sat down at my kitchen table with a pen, a notebook, and no more reasons to delay. I opened to a blank page and wrote, "This isn't about food." Then I paused. Because it wasn't. Not really. It never was. Yes, I built a restaurant. Yes, I learned to infuse broth with meaning to plate memory onto bone-white china. But when I was scrubbing pans until my knuckles bled, when I was slicing onions at 3 a.m., with tears that had nothing to do with the sting. None of that was about culinary ambition. It was about dignity. It was about surviving the night and still being able to look yourself in the mirror come morning. I wrote another line. This is about silence, the kind that sharpens you. The kind that makes people underestimate you until the day you walk into your own dining room and take your rightful seat. And maybe for some that's petty. Maybe I should have said something sooner. Maybe I should have told them I wasn't who they thought I was. But if I had, I would have missed the truth. Hiding in plain sight, people tell you who they are by how they treat you when they think you're powerless. That's what I wanted this book to be. Not a collection of clever twists on classics. but a reflection of what it means to cook for yourself when no one else does. To stand at a stove and reclaim your name, your worth, your silence, not as weakness, but as space. Space to grow. Space to forgive. Space to become. I flipped the page. Wrote a header. Chapter 1, The Burnt Rice Years, and under it I scribbled a line I hadn't thought about in years. Some nights I ate rice scraped off the bottom of the pot. It tasted like smoke and pride. I smiled. Because even then with nothing, I had refused to go hungry in more ways than one. Across the room, the soft hum of the fridge, the distant clink of the restaurant shutting down, the faint buzz of my phone. I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to. For once I was full in the truest way. Not because the world had seen me, but because I had chosen to see myself. And this time, I wasn't writing to prove anything. I was writing to remember. To leave a trail behind in case someone else somewhere someday needs a way out of their own quiet kitchen too.